I'd like to welcome you to our study in the book of 2 Corinthians. Yesterday we began with chapter 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and we covered verses 1 and 2. Now today we're moving on, and we're going to be looking at verse number 3 to begin with. Now, the Apostle Paul has been talking about the offering that was taken in the area of Macedonia. And he said that this offering was taken in the grace of God. If you didn't listen to yesterday's podcast, go back to yesterday's podcast and listen to it. Because when Paul takes this offering, and by the way, let me just say this, Paul mentions the offering several times in his writings, but this is an in-depth teaching on taking offerings, and he starts with this amazing thing. He starts with the grace of God. And so listen to yesterday's podcast. Now he goes on in verse number verse number 3, and he says this, "For I testify that according to their ability." What's Paul doing? Paul is giving a testimony. He's saying, I'm testifying. I'm speaking of what they've done. I'm speaking about the actions of the churches in Macedonia. And what does he say? That he says that according to their ability. In other words, what's Paul saying? Paul is saying that the grace of God came in so that their own ability, their own power to do something, that they gave according to their own ability. Now, what does that mean? They gave according to their bank account. We'll put it in a modern vernacular. They gave according to what they had in the bank, what they could afford to give. But that's not where the Apostle Paul ends. How many of you know that it takes the grace of God to give, especially in great poverty, especially in times where there's affliction going on, trouble, persecution going on. It takes the grace of God to give, even from your own finances, from what you have. But then the Apostle Paul goes on and he says, and beyond their ability. They gave beyond their natural ability to give. What does that mean? That they wrote cold checks? No, that's not what it means. What it means is they've got a stack of bills over here that need to be paid. They've got food that they need to buy for their kids, but what they did is because of the grace of God, and again, that is the central theme of taking an offering, the grace of God. But because of the grace of God, they could say, you know what, we're going to give, but we're not going to dive into, or we're going to dive into the money that we've got to spend to exist. Beyond their ability, beyond what they have, beyond the bills that needed to be paid, they gave because of the grace of God. Now, let me say this to you. Please listen to me. I've heard preachers do this. Well, give out of your poverty, give out of your need. Well, you know what? You can't, if you give out of your need without the grace of God, let me tell you something. You're giving in your own ability, and you're not giving in the ability of the grace of God. Now, I can testify to you, and from my own life, there are times where God has asked us to give beyond our ability. And you know what? God always provides. Why? Because of the unmerited favor of God, because of the grace of God. And so the Apostle Paul says these Macedonians, they gave according to their ability, they gave beyond their ability, and they gave of their own accord. What does that mean? They gave because they wanted to. They gave because they've made a decision. We're going to give. Now, let me say this. The Apostle Paul gave them a program, and we're going to talk about that probably tomorrow. He said, you know what, give like this. But you know what? He also said, if you want to do it. They gave of their own accord. They didn't give because they were under pressure. They didn't give because the pastor was up there saying, you got to give, you got to give, you got to give. They didn't give to show off. You know, we'd been in churches all around the world, and I remember being in a church where they said, oh, everybody take your offering and wave it in the air. And you know what? It caused people to be pressured to give. The Apostle Paul said that they gave in their own accord. They were willing. They chose to give. And now going on into verse number 4, begging us with much urging for the favor of participating in the support of the saints. Not only did they give willingly, but notice what the Apostle Paul says here. He says they were begging us. This word begging, you know, sometimes this word is actually used in prayer, that we are begging God for things. They're begging. They're showing a deep down desire. They're begging. They're making a request. Paul, please let us give. Now notice what he says. He says they're begging us with much urging. How many of you know there's begging and then there's begging with urging? It means they're begging with this deep down desperation. We have got to give. We've got to do it. I remember being in Volgograd, Russia, and a lady got up and she testified that she obeyed God and gave outside of her ability. And then she testified that God had blessed her with a tremendous amount of finances. And you know what happened? That pastor, great man of God, Alexei, forgot to take an offering that night. And you know what I saw? I actually saw people chasing him down the street saying, hey, you forgot to take an offering. I got to give. Well, that's exactly what the Apostle Paul is talking about. Now notice, this offering wasn't taken for the Apostle Paul. It was taken for the support of the saints. What does that mean? The Apostle Paul was taking offerings for the saints that were in Jerusalem. You see, the saints in Jerusalem were losing everything they had. They were losing their families. They were losing their homes. They were losing their businesses because of persecution. And the Apostle Paul had it on his heart that the Gentile churches needed to give and contribute to the needs of those people in Jerusalem. Now, I believe we're going to talk more about that tomorrow. So join us tomorrow as we continue our study in the book of 2 Corinthians.